In our last session, we dealt with the character qualities of those who are elders or overseers. And I would encourage you, even if you are a deacon and not an elder overseer, to also watch that session. And part of the reason is there's a number of similarities to how we dealt with the text in that session and how we will see the text in this. And we'll somewhat move through it rather quickly because of that parallel. But again, just to emphasize the fact, when the Bible talks about these roles and responsibilities as leaders, it prioritizes the characteristics or the qualities of the leader, the character, the heart of the leader, more than it does the specific duties. That being said, we are going to talk about the role of deacon. And we find this role in a couple different texts. Dominantly today, we're going to talk about Acts chapter 6 and 1 Timothy chapter 3. Now, you might be thinking about yourself in your own church. We don't have deacons in our church. Well, I've actually had a church leader, an elder actually came and asked me that question and said, we don't have deacons in our church. And my response to them was maybe a little bit in jest, but my response was, well, yes, you do. You just don't call them by that name. You call them by something else. Maybe, again, you call them minister or ministry team leader. Minister. This is that Latin translation of the Greek word deacon. And I would even, to this person, have a conversation about this word team. Because that to me is interesting, that we've taken a kind of an American metaphor, if you will, kind of our priority, the kind of our preference to win, and we've slapped it on this metaphor of service, and we said these are winning teams that serve. And that's not a bad thing, but let's just acknowledge which metaphor is taking the lead. Are they supposed to serve, or are they supposed to win? Let's make sure that, biblically we're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that's usually true with ministry teams. There's also the term, servant that we could translate this as. And so we have servant team leaders or servant leaders, those types of ways that we acknowledge this. And all of those are helpful. Whether we use the word deacon or we have ministry team leaders or servant leaders, all of those are fine and accurate translations of the New Testament. Here's my concern. Here's my, maybe for you, suggestion. Sometimes we can fail to, because we use a label that doesn't have the label deacon, we can fail to prioritize the characteristics that the Bible prioritizes because we don't use this term. Does that make sense? So they can have all of the giftings and have the skill sets that we need for them to carry out or execute what we're asking them to do. If that's serving in a capacity widows or serving, building maintenance, whatever that is. Whatever that area of ministry or mercy is, they have the skill sets, but maybe we don't actually come back to the text and say, but do they have the character? So in our last session, we talked about the character of elders and said that this text, especially 1 Timothy, is more concerned about a portrait of one who is above reproach. And so the word here we see is perhaps translated, if it's ESV, blameless. And that becomes a parallel concept, a synonym really. Within this range of above reproach. What we're looking at is the character of a person, and can they be accused of not being authentic? Are they looked at by insiders inside the community of faith, and people go, that's not someone I really want to follow if I'm following Jesus? No, those who lead should be above reproach. Well, that's the same portrait we have here. It's not really a checklist as much as it's a painting, and the must be is they must be above reproach, they must be blameless. So we could read through 1 Timothy and notice those same kinds of things, those same categories, in fact, other than lacking one category. The ability to teach is not one of the character qualities or characteristics of those who are deacons. Again, this is a different role. I would again argue that deacons are not just elders in training or elders in waiting or some of the other. We've used some of those phrases in churches I've been a part of. No, this is a different role and responsibility altogether. Now, they obviously interact, but these aren't just those who are a little bit less mature in Christ. They are still people who are mature in their faith, maybe not as mature when it comes to years as being a follower of Jesus, but we appropriately match their character and maturity to their responsibility. That's what we see in the book of Acts chapter 6 as well. Even early on in the church, a need comes up. And in fact, I would argue that a need is a significant part of how and we'll see this, how we select those who will serve in this capacity. In the book of Acts, a need comes up. There are widows who are not being fed. They happen to be Greek widows. And so those who are dominantly responsible for the teaching and discipleship, that capacity, they know that they can't do both well. They can't serve tables well as serving up a healthy diet of the word, and so they need help. Well, this word is a word that was common in the world around them, let alone in the Jewish world. And so this idea of someone who was going to serve was the label they used. Again, responsibility, not a title. And so we see the selection of those who are adequately equipped to meet the need. But notice again, we sometimes miss this, that first they choose those who were known to be, the NIV says, or the ESV says, of good repute. They were known to be full of the Spirit and full of wisdom. Again, we see this. They were known to be, they were of good repute. They were an example. They were already someone who people could look to and say, that person looks like Jesus. Now, that should make sense for us to connect the dots and go, servant leader, looks like Jesus. Those two better go together. And I would argue for you that as you walk through even 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 8 through 13, that you recognize each of these characteristics that are painted here. That's what we are getting at. You know, they must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. Their motivation is pure. They must be tested first. So let me pause and talk about that word. Because I don't view this as a checklist, I think that this word tested is something we can actually apply to both overseers and to those who are deacons. This word tested was a word that was common in the ancient world for someone who was perhaps applying for a job. Well, are they adequately prepared for this job? Do they have what it takes? Do they have the character that it takes? Do they have the skill sets that it takes? Well, this is that word tested. And the Bible's not explicit on telling us how we test people other than by saying we test them for these characteristics. I would argue that one of the things that we need to do more adequately in many of our churches is to take our time, is to slow down and disciple leaders and to test them, to give them responsibilities and see how they handle them and allow them to grow into the responsibility. If your church is like many of the churches I've interacted with, sometimes we're merely reacting to timetables that are caused by bylaws, and we nominate leaders and we select leaders because the timeline is coming up, the congregational meeting is coming up, and really when it comes to an adequate process to disciple, develop, help mature, to test someone, we're probably failing in that regard. And maybe that's some of the reason for us to use terms like this, is that it's a little easier for us to move and maybe turn a blind eye to some of these other issues. So this phrase tested is important for us to notice. Another key issue in this particular text, 1 Timothy chapter 3, comes up in verse 11, and we need to mention it here briefly. In verse 11, Paul says this, "Their wives likewise must be dignified." Now, you might pause there because your translation might say, "Women likewise must be dignified." The translation there is actually rather vague. It can be accurately translated either way, women in general or their wives. The word "there" is not there. That's added in by the translation to help us with how they are understanding it. But here's a dynamic in this text that is interesting for us. Notice that when it comes to the wives of the elders, Paul doesn't have anything to say about that. But when it comes to deacons, it's either wives or women. That's maybe a little bit odd. What's going on here? Well, really, there's two options. Option number one is, well, Paul is just adding in, here's some characteristics that their wives need to have if they serve as deacons. Option number two is this, that Paul is actually referring to those who are women who are serving in this capacity. In fact, the feminine ending for deacon, we would say deaconess, was not around, as far as we are aware, when Paul wrote this letter. In fact, when Paul does refer to a woman as a servant, as he does in some of his other letters, for instance, in regard to Phoebe, he uses the phrase, the masculine ending, deacon. Now, translators sometimes translate that minister or servant, but it's the same concept. And so the argument here is that this could actually refer to those who were women who are serving in this capacity, that Paul is acknowledging, yes, those two who serve as servant leaders must have these character qualities and be above reproach. So we could reverse some of the character traits, the paintings, if you will, to make sure that this matches, to make sure that, and he goes through some of those characteristics as well, dignified, not slanderers, sober-minded, faithful in all things. We could even flip-flop the husband of one wife to say, well, faithful in her marriage, wife of one husband. Regardless on how you understand that translation, I think both are available. We do need to ask this question: if this is not an honorific title, if this is not an office, but this is a responsibility, do we have women who serve in this capacity of responsibility, have this responsibility, this role in the church, but we just don't call them by the same name? You see, that's part of the problem by using these as offices rather than just saying, here's the role that you have in the family, is then we get rather inconsistent with our translations and our understandings, and we call some people coordinators and some people we call ministers, and yet they're doing the same thing. I just want to challenge you to seek consistency in your understanding and interpretation. Again, both options seem to be the case. I would argue, however, from 1 Timothy 2 and 3, my own understanding is that the role of overseer elder is reserved for those who are men. That is the kind of the connection into chapter 2 of must not teach or be a teaching authority, must not teach nor have authority. I see those two concepts linked. Then in chapter 3 is the role of elder overseer. I think that's reserved for men who are mature. Not all men in the church, but men who are mature in Christ in the church. In the role of a deacon, I do see this translation possibility being an either or. I hope that's helpful for you. In fact, I'd invite you to interact with me if you have further questions in regard to that. This is a particular area of study that I've been able to do over a number of years. So that question does become important for you, and I want you to be able to do that. Let's get back to kind of big picture of this dynamic. Notice again, we are looking for those whose character, it causes them to automatically be a leader. In fact, we should observe this already being a part of their life. I would just warn us against choosing those whose dominant role is to lead out on service, choosing people who don't serve. Obviously, you see the inconsistency in that. Here's another dynamic that I think is important. Throughout the Bible, we are called to equip one another towards service. This is Ephesians 4 especially, Ephesians 4:11 through 16. I'll encourage you to study that on your own. But one of the things we see there is that the role of teachers and the role of leaders is ultimately to equip God's people for service. This is one of the areas where I feel like we need to do a better job in many of our churches. We need to raise up those who are gifted to lead, to serve, equipping them with what they need, equipping them in discipleship so that they can carry out their ministry of the gospel. There is perhaps a danger of us always having this role be a staff member. I think one of the dangers we need to just be aware of, and you need to dialogue about this dynamic amongst yourselves with your own leaders, is that can this actually limit our capacity to disciple other people by having everything be a professional role of leadership? And so rather than having those who are growing into an area of service, we have those who are coming in from the outside. Again, that's a challenge, something for you to think about. As we wrap up this conversation, where are we going next? Well, we're going to talk about the specific duties and responsibilities of those who are elders and those who are deacons. That's going to come back to some of these conversations, and we'll connect some of the dots. I hope to see you as you join us back for those sessions.